Hello, this is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe, your host today for American Ambassadors Live, a podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who represent America from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump. Our guest today is the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchison, who served from 2017 to January of 2021. Prior to her ambassadorship, she was elected to the Texas House of Representatives as the Texas State Treasurer and to the United States Senate. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, she was deeply involved in NATO and other international issues. Ambassador, welcome.
I am so glad to be with you, Ambassador, and glad we got a chance to meet over the phone before and recognize our mutual backgrounds of being in the trenches in the state legislatures.
Absolutely. One of the aphorisms that people live by is all politics is local, but when you work in American politics and then you have to deal with international politics, you realize there's some commonalities.
Yes, right. Their politics is also all local. So
exactly.
That makes for negotiation.
Exactly. Let's start off with your experience and views around NATO when you served in the United States Senate, because you were very involved with NATO long before you became ambassador. And therefore, over a period of time, during different presidential administrations, different international situations. I'd be interested in, how did you see NATO during your Senate years?
You know, it's an interesting question, because I dealt with NATO a lot in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then I was chairman of military construction, of appropriations, and I was on the defense appropriations. I was all into the military. So I really dealt with NATO and visited NATO in Senate meetings in Brussels. But I looked at NATO as an essential transatlantic alliance that was very collaborative and so helpful for the United States to be able to have allies that would work with us for mutual concerns in Europe. Of course, the original reason was that Europe wanted America in early rather than late, as we were in World War II after so much destruction. And that was my kind of overview when I was in the Senate. That when I got into NATO itself and began to see more of the processes, it was, I learned a lot. I guess I thought I knew everything pretty much before I left, but I didn't. It's a very different place when you are on the ground there and you realize how much leadership America is expected to have, and also the negotiating process, which is very different.
So again, looking at it from when you were in the Senate, it was a different time. I mean, it was including the post 9/11 period when NATO got involved with us in Afghanistan and other places. Was that controversial in the Congress? The notion of, here we have this European alliance and here we're going outside of Europe. How did that play out from sort of the Senate perspective on the role of NATO?
From the Senate perspective, I would say the biggest controversy during my time was in the enlargement. It was not in it was not in going to Afghanistan, because of course Afghanistan was NATO's answer to Article 5. Right. NATO invoked Article 5. When one of us is attacked, we're all attacked. For the United States, that's the only time Article 5 has been invoked. And that's what put us into Afghanistan, because America said, this is where the plot for 9/11 was hatched, which it was, and we need to assure a stabilization in that country so that more terrorist cells will not be able to operate there, train there, grow there, and be exported to our countries. So Afghanistan was our ask, and our NATO allies stood with us and did for the whole almost 20 years that we have been there. And it was not, I mean, of course, we talked about the fact that we were going in to another country, but it was definitely considered a common threat.
Gotcha. And it was something that was not controversial to your, and yeah, I'm talking in the United States. It was like we were glad that they were helping us when we were under attack, and therefore it seemed like
well, we always, I mean, you know, from being in the political arena that it's a discussion when you're sending troops into harm's way. Yes, it is. And I don't mean to bypass that part, but we were going there. That was a decision that we were going to wipe out the terrorist capabilities there on our behalf. So when NATO stood with us at our request, that was, of course, an important part of the NATO alliance. Basically, in the big issues, NATO expects America to lead, and they will work with us and be with us. I won't say they follow our every step, but in the big things, they do. And I didn't realize to the extent that that was the case until I was there, but they expected me to lead. They expected me to be very transparent with them, let them know what was going on for their preparation. But in general, they were going to work with us where we determined that there was a mutual threat. And of course, that became a big issue when the American Strategic Review came forward in 2018 or 19 and said China is the biggest threat, and we must start deterring capabilities and be ready. And our other allies went, what? And so we had to work to bring them in, and we are still working on that, Ambassador. We are still trying to bring the EU, the European allies that we have that are not in the EU, of course, into the alliance speaking with one voice to China. And I think that's one of the major things that President Biden is doing during this summit period, is saying we must be allied on Russia, on China, and we need to address this with one voice.
Some of the experience you had as you were ambassador obviously involved Russia and Ukraine. And as you say, some of it involved China. Obviously, Russia is the traditional threat to the NATO alliance. And obviously, China is the new threat. How would you paint a picture of, during your time there as ambassador, of how our NATO allies looked at Russia? Obviously, there were different countries have different points of view, but I'd be interested in you painting a picture because you spent so much time trying to understand where they were coming from. Let's start with Russia, and then we'll come back to China.
Yes, on Russia, the Eastern Europeans are very clear. There is no gray area for them. They have dealt with Russia. They know Russia. I mean, they've been part of the Soviet Union, and they are very strong in believing that you speak to Russia from power, and that's the only thing that works. And so they are very strong with us, and they want us to be strong as well with dealing with Putin. Some of our allies, however, are more of the, well, we should have dialogue. we need to have dialogue with Russia. We need good relations with Russia. Most certainly the Nord Stream 2 that is coming into Germany is very big concern in NATO. It's a big concern even in the EU. I would say that every other European country tried in every way to dissuade Germany from finishing that pipeline, because this is going to give an economic boost to Russia to do all of the malign things that they're doing to every one of our countries. So I would say Germany and France are certainly in the let's talk, let's keep relations, and Spain and Italy follow that also. And so I think we work with all of these sort of levels of intensity about Russia at NATO. And we are trying to firm up that, because Russia has gotten more and more belligerent, doing more and more harm through cyber, through ransomware, as well as the buildup on the borders of Ukraine and what they're doing in Georgia, which is tragic. So I think we in NATO, we keep talking and we keep trying to work through the variations in intensity, I would say. If you talk to France or Germany, they would say, oh, we understand Russia. But in their way of handling Putin is different from Poland, Czech Republic, Bulgaria,
Sure.
and the Baltics.
You mentioned the Nord Stream. This is the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe that has been a German-Russian project. It is not a hard security project. It's not about where you put missiles. It's not about that sort of thing. How is that project discussed in NATO, or is that kind of an informal discussion where when you're in NATO, it kind of comes up, but it's not really a NATO negotiating issue? That'd be interesting, I think, to understand.
Well, it's not a NATO negotiation, but it is very, very talked about. And I would say every ally has been very clear. Well, I can't say every, but just virtually every ally has been clear. Germany clearly was on the other side, and some allies didn't speak loudly on this, but even the EU voted to request that Germany not do this, because it's not like it's a missile buildup, but it is giving, well, first of all, it's giving a lot of leverage to Russia. It is bypassing Ukraine, where Ukraine has been the conduit, and Russia has used that against the Ukraine. We've seen what Russia will do. They just close the pipeline and let the Ukrainians really freeze for a while. Now, they are unlikely to do something so bold with Germany, but 10 years from now, will they be? If they keep getting by with, if Putin keeps getting by with incremental provocation, he will get more and more bold, because he does only, I believe, and many of our allies believe, respond to absolute deterrence, and that's what we try to do at NATO. And we know that Russia is building up a lot of missiles. They were violating the INF treaty, and therefore they have an intermediate missile capability that is worrying the countries on the other side of the Black Sea, especially like Romania, like Bulgaria, and then Ukraine, of course. But our allies are concerned about what they see Russia doing. We just have to speak with a strong voice.
Two last questions on Russia, and then I do want to switch over to China. Is it your impression that Germany's obviously very strong commitment to pursuing the Nord Stream project is mostly economic and commercial, or mostly strategic? It's obviously both, but I've never quite understood which is the dominant motivation. Do you have any insight into that for Germany?
Well, I think that's an interesting question because in general, Germany and France and the Western Europeans tend to put economics ahead of security. And I would say that is especially true with China, um, somewhat true for Russia, because Russia doesn't have as much potential trade as China does. And I'd say that that is partly true, but I think it's also strategic, that they believe keeping good relations with Russia will keep Russia from being belligerent or attacking their governments. So I think it is both, but I would say economics always factors in for many of the Western European countries.
Gotcha. And the last question related particularly to Russia and attitudes in Western Europe. Given your American political experience, it's very relevant here, all politics being local. Did you see when you were ambassador, or before, but particularly when you were ambassador, that the postures that European countries would take, particularly Western European countries would take, would change based on changes in party control in a country?
That is a tough question because in the Western European countries, I would say mostly it's pretty steady either way. But then you look at, well, like Hungary, for instance, is more in the camp of trying to get along with Russia.
Right.
And that's certainly an Eastern European country. It's a tough call on the real democracies that do change. I don't see much change among Russian, well,
Okay.
I mean, among German parties, although certainly, well, let me back up and say, remember that so often, like in Germany, there's a coalition government.
Right.
And in many of these other European countries, that is the case. So it does sort of mitigate what a party change can do. So I guess that's really a more relevant point, because I think if Angela Merkel had her way, she would be maybe dealing a little tougher with Russia, but she's got a very strong coalition government because they're very split now among three parties. Really, the Green Party has come up so much in Germany. So I think I would say because of that. And of course, Macron is almost an independent party himself. So he has coalitions within his. So that's what I think is probably the more relevant.
No, I mean, that's really actually, I think, a very important broad insight in terms of stability of foreign policy in Western European countries, because they unlike the UK and the United States, they typically do not have clearly defined two-party systems where things go back and forth. They're much more. I mean, Belgium is the extreme case. I mean, they have like 12 parties in their government all the time, or something like that. I'm not quite sure.
Right.
But that leads to stability, which I think is a very important insight. Let's switch over to China a little bit. From a security point of view, and I understand everybody wants to do business with China until they tap your phones and, take down your computer system. Everybody wants to do business with China until that happens. But on the security side, what's your impression from obviously working with the Western and Eastern Europeans so closely over the last few years? To what extent do they perceive a security threat to themselves from China?
I think they are seeing it now. I think that the Europeans have come a long way, just in the years that I was at NATO. When we brought up the problems with Huawei and 5G, our European allies were going, what? This is a time when Huawei was underbidding the other 5G potential networks. And they were going, well, why would we do that? It was fortunate at the time, honestly, that the US did not have the capability to be a competitor, because Huawei had undermined the profitability of 5G networks. So American companies were really not in the mix. It was European countries that had the secure 5G network operations, but they were more expensive. However, I want to say that the Europeans came around very, very much in the last 3 years, and most of them now have laws. In fact, Germany has a very strong law. The others have come around to strong laws that say our 5G networks will not be allowed to come into we will not have a company in our network that is in an authoritarian regime and is therefore untrustworthy. That's the way they do it. They don't say Huawei, but they're clear. And I think I'm cautiously optimistic, but leaning on the optimistic side, that we are going to have clear networks. NATO adopted it immediately because our military people, this was not a political thing at all. It was our military people who said, we can't have Huawei in our secure networks. And that really began to turn the tide, because all these countries' militaries said, hey, wait a minute, if we can't talk among each other, and if we can't communicate with the United States and Canada, then our security is at risk. So I think that on the Huawei, on that point, I think the Europeans have really come around and are being responsible.
Again, that's a good example of how the NATO process, having particularly all the military folks meeting together regularly, helps develop consensus. That's what I was impressed with when I was ambassador, was how and I didn't understand this until I was ambassador, how closely the militaries work together. And it's a cultural thing to some extent. The fact that they know each other, the fact they listen to each other, the fact that they have to think about problems together leads to incredible cooperation.
And they really are almost non-political. They really are looking at the military. They've trained together. Many of them have gone to school together. You know, a lot of them are trained at our academies, our military academies. And so they talk about all the time. It'll be, oh, you know, we were lieutenants together, or we were classmates at one of our war colleges or one of their war colleges. They really do keep those ties. And that is very helpful and makes, I think, that the fact that we are a political and military alliance is probably what has kept us the longest military alliance in the history of the world. And over 70 years now, we have worked in tandem with our military.
And one last question. One of the issues that's been around forever and will be around for at least a while, maybe forever, is the European partners paying what we consider their fair share of the budget for NATO. Be interested in your insights as to, from the American perspective, it's kind of obvious, all for one, one for all. We're the biggest country, we should make the biggest contribution, but we shouldn't make a disproportionate contribution. If you're a small country, you should make a smaller contribution, but it should be proportionate. But President Trump made that a very public issue. Other presidents have made it a less public issue, but everyone agreed with it. Why is it so hard for the Europeans to meet that 2% standard of a commitment, in both in their defense budgets themselves and more generally? Well,
this is where the American leadership is so important, because in general, Europeans do put economics over security. And you have to say they're small countries. They are all smaller than our big country. And therefore, you have to understand that they're looking at economics. But from our viewpoint, security is first, and that creates the good economics. What the way we look at it is, if you are secure and if you can repel enemies, then you will have investment from the outside, you will have trust, and you will have trade relations with other like-minded countries. So we do put security first, and they then expect, the Europeans know that they need for us to be the big deterrent. They have relied on us to be their backstop for security. And every president I served with, and I've served with four, every one of them, Republican and Democrat, said the same thing. Europe needs to do more for their own security. And everybody agreed with that. But it's hard for those Europeans when they're small countries and they have a lot of needs for their budgets to take that step. Now, I will say that the common funding of NATO does account for the smaller countries on their gross domestic products. It's a percentage of gross domestic products, except for Germany and the US. And Germany and the US give equally now in the common funding. And then all of the others go by that gross domestic product. We go above that. Both Germany and America are way above our gross domestic product percent, because that's what is the strength that we have. But I would say that we are always going to need to have the transatlantic bond. Europe, in my opinion, I mean, this is a long shot, but they will never be able to defend themselves. That's why it is good for us to be in right now with them, continuing to push them to do more. And frankly, they have stepped up to do more. They've increased their spending by $140 billion just in the last 4 years. So they are stepping up, and they realize that they have to do more. But we are the catalyst for this. And when we declare, for instance, that China is now a potential adversary, that we have to start a deterrence to assure that they never will be able to attack us. They have listened. They are, in varying degrees, beginning to see that this is going to be important, especially, of course, because the kind of warfare that we're talking about now is much different. It's not really going to be tanks coming from China to Europe. It's going to be cyber, it's going to be satellites, it's going to be artificial intelligence. And so that's what now NATO is moving in that direction. According to our military advice, we are moving in the direction of doing more in the kind of warfare that we will have for the future in a united transatlantic way.
Ambassador Hutchison, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been great to visit with you, and we'll look forward to having more dialogue and conversations. I really appreciate the American Ambassadors Council just informing and talking among each other about our experiences. And I know you were ambassador to Romania, and that was a great ally in NATO. In fact, the Deputy Secretary General is a wonderful Romanian who was the foreign minister as well as the Romanian ambassador to the US, and he loves America, and the Romanians have been great allies. So we'll always, I hope, be able to share our experiences among the allies that we have in the council, and appreciate so much making this available.
Thank you. This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to America's Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag Ambassadors Live. Thanks.